I call Holly Walker.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to start my contribution in this committee of the whole stage by thanking the Select Committee for, I think, a very constructive approach and process on this bill. And I very much enjoyed being part of it. And I think there are a number of sensible amendments recommended by the committee by consensus which improve the bill and which strengthen and are a good example of how the Select Committee process can work and should work more often in this Parliament to work collaboratively to improve legislation. Mr. Chair, broadly speaking, this is a good bill which the Green Party supports. It brings some of the provisions for local body elections governing candidate donations more closely in line with the equivalent provisions governing general elections and parliamentary candidate donations and returns. And it's obviously been prompted by a very high-profile example in the 2010 Auckland mayoralty elections with the Honourable John Banks and his memory lapses around the anonymous donations that he received. And it's timely for that reason, but also, irregardless of that example, important changes that we think need to be made in the interests of transparency and fairness. Probably the most significant change that the bill makes is the change to anonymous donation provisions so that anyone who works with a candidate now and who knows the identity of someone who makes a donation to that candidate of more than $1,500 must declare the identity of that donor to the candidate, and that candidate must therefore record that in their return of expenses and donations. And I guess that's what we might call the John Banks provision in this bill, Mr. Chair, and it's a good change, and it's a change that we in the Green Party support. However, we think the bill does represent a missed opportunity to more properly align the local electoral rules with the rules for parliamentary elections. And in the second reading debate, speakers on both sides of the House talked about this being the object of the legislation, and yet if that is indeed the object of the legislation, there's much more we could do that would align the provisions governing the two types of elections. And it's a missed opportunity that the bill doesn't actually do more in that direction. However, on that note, we are pleased to see the Minister's amendments set out in SOP number 198, which do bring the bill a little bit closer in alignment with the provisions in the Electoral Act by requiring donors to disclose when a donation is funded from contributions, the name and address of every contributor who makes a contribution of more than $1,500 and the total amount of contributions received from contributors that make contributions of more than $1,500, the total amount of all other contributions, and that requires the candidate to disclose in their return of donations and expenses the identity of any donor who has made contributions in excess of $1,500. And that's contributions in cash or in kind. So it makes clear in the Minister's SOP that that contribution could be a monetary donation, but it could also be a donation of goods and services. It's a good amendment. It does, as the previous speaker said, fill a gap that was left after the committee had considered the bill, and we commend the Minister for bringing it to the House, and the Green Party will support the Minister's amendments. But, Mr. Chair, we think there's still much more that this bill could do to align provisions for local body elections with those governing general elections. And the supplementary order paper in my name, number 200, puts forward a set of more comprehensive changes that would enhance the fairness and transparency of local body elections and candidate expenses and donations. And the measures in my supplementary order paper mirror the provisions of a members' bill in the name of my colleague Denise Roach, which has been in the ballot for some time actually before this legislation was introduced to the House, and we think would be a better way of addressing both the John Banks concerns and fixing up the provisions around anonymous donations, but actually making some more comprehensive and wholesale changes to the law governing local body elections. So our amendments would more effectively regulate the influence of wealth in local body election campaigns, and they would promote transparency and accountability. And they would do that in a number of ways. The main provisions in my supplementary order paper before the committee at the moment is to introduce a cap on donations by any person or group of a total of $5,000, to lower the threshold for the disclosure of anonymous donations to be declared down to $500 from the $1,500 proposed in this bill, to introduce a ban on overseas donations, to introduce a pecuniary interest register for members of local authorities, Mr Chair. Thank you, Mr Chair. Much as we have as members of Parliament to file our pecuniary interest register, and perhaps most importantly, Mr Chair, to regulate third-party spending in local elections. And I want to spend a bit of time talking about the need for the regulation of third-party spending and what a glaring omission it is that this bill doesn't address third-party spending. Now, if we think about the Auckland mayoral elections in the post-Super City environment, we see that we have a hugely influential position in terms of a local body election that candidates are running for. There's a lot at stake in who will be the mayor of our largest city. There's a lot of interested parties that have a stake in the outcome of who is the mayor of our largest city. There are a lot of organisations who may wish to actively campaign either for or against a particular candidate or ticket in those elections. And while that's particularly apparent in Auckland, in the Super City, those very same issues are at stake in many local body elections around the country where local groups, organisations, businesses or individuals have an interest in the outcome of the election and may indeed wish to campaign and to spend their money campaigning towards a particular outcome in that election. And there's very little in the current regulations or provisions that actually regulate the spending activities of third parties in local body elections, and there's nothing in this bill that would rectify that. And some might argue, and indeed some have put this argument to me, that local body elections are lower profile and less likely to attract substantial third-party spending and campaigning, and there's therefore no need for this kind of provision. And that may well have been the case in the past, I think, Mr Chair. But with the greater amalgamation that we've seen in Auckland and that we are perhaps unfortunately likely to see more around the country, I think we're only likely to see more interest and third-party activity in local body campaigning. And indeed we are seeing it already. And I've used this example in the second reading debate, but we know, for example, that there is a wealthy individual in Hamilton who plans to campaign against every single incumbent councillor on the Hamilton City Council, and there's absolutely nothing in the current provisions to stop him from doing so or to restrict what he can spend in that campaign in any way, and that just doesn't seem right if we have a piece of legislation like this which looks to set spending caps and actually regulate local body electoral campaigning in some way. We also see the increasing use of campaign tickets to campaign in local body elections. And again, there's nothing to restrict third parties from donating to the campaign ticket, and if it's not allocated to an individual candidate on that campaign ticket, there's no limit on what can be donated, what has to be disclosed and how it can be spent. So it's a real gap in this bill, and it's a gap that the committee recognised, and we said in our report that further amendments to regulate third-party spending are absolutely necessary to prevent inequities in the future, and yet we haven't seen them come through the committee due to time constraints. And the chair of the committee did actually express some hope in the second reading that the minister would bring amendments to this effect in this committee of the whole stage, and I note that that hasn't happened, and I'm very disappointed to see that. So in the absence of amendments from the Minister to make this change, I'd urge the House instead to support our SOP number 200 because it does bring in regulations for third-party spending which are so needed, and it does also more closely align the provisions governing local body elections with those governing parliamentary elections. Mr Chair, the other area of concern which my colleague Eugenie Sage will speak about when she speaks to her supplementary order paper is around the provisions that this bill makes to allow the Minister to postpone or adjourn local body elections. We're concerned, in the light of the experience at Environment Canterbury, that that's not an appropriate mechanism, although it might be necessary to allow that adjournment to take place. It should be the electoral officer who does that, not the Minister, and my colleague Eugenie Sage will speak to her SOP to that effect later in the debate. But for now, Mr Chair, I'd like to urge the House to consider the importance of regulating third-party spending in local body elections and ask members to look closely at my SOP number 200 and the provisions within it.
Mr Chair.
Call Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr.